Hey there, thanks for joining me today. Before we dive into this haunting true crime story set in the United States, I want to take a moment to set the stage for what you're about to read. I always find that these stories are more than a recounting of events. They're an exploration of the fragile, complex bonds that tie us together as families and as members of a community. This story, in particular, will challenge our understanding of morality, adolescence, and the incredible pressures that can push ordinary people to unthinkable acts. As I sit down to write this, I'm reminded again how easily we take for granted the comfort and safety of our own homes. All across America, suburban neighborhoods look peaceful from the outside, their neat rows of houses masking secrets and struggles that go unnoticed by neighbors and friends. Sometimes, within those walls, pain festers in silence. Sometimes the consequences spill out into the open with shocking force. I want us to approach this story not just with curiosity, but with empathy. It's easy, maybe even satisfying, to cast judgment when confronted with the unimaginable. But behind every headline and every police report are real people, shaped by their circumstances, their pasts, and the choices of others. My hope is that as we walk through this series of events together, we'll reflect not just on what happened, but on the why. The turbulent undercurrents of resentment, hurt, and hope that flow beneath the surface of a family in distress. I invite you to read with an open mind and consider, how could these events have been prevented? What warning signs might have been visible to those nearby? And most importantly, what lessons can we learn about support, intervention, and the responsibilities we each carry within our own circles? With that in mind, let's begin this journey through a true American tragedy, one that shocked a community, scarred those involved, and left ripples that are still felt long after the headlines faded away. The midnight emergency call. It was approaching 10:30 p.m. on a frigid January night in 2003, the sort of dark, wind-battered evening when most families in the suburbs of upstate New York hurried to retreat into the warmth of their homes. At the local police dispatch center, a sudden shrill ring interrupted the measured quiet of the control room. The dispatcher, accustomed to false alarms and routine disturbances, picked up the phone, only to be met with the uncontrollable sobs of a young woman on the other end. Her voice wavered between gasps for breath and desperate pleas for help. "My mom, she's not moving. Please, send someone quickly. She was taking a bath. I think she's hurt, or worse." Pain, terror, and confusion mingled in her every word. She identified herself as Emily, just 16, her voice cracking under the weight of panic. In the background, another girl could be faintly heard crying, occasionally choking out fractured sentences that only added to the dispatcher's alarm. The address she rattled off was a tidy, middle-class home nestled in the maze of snow-dusted roads skirting the edge of the small town of Willow Springs, New York. A picture of domestic tranquility, now shattered by a sudden, unexplained catastrophe. The dispatcher's hands moved swiftly from muscle memory. Send an ambulance, alert patrol, notify medical personnel. "Stay with me," she coaxed. "Help is on the way. Is your mom breathing? Are you alone in the house?" As the sisters tried shakily to answer, the operator could hear muffled footsteps and the echoed sounds of panic ricocheting off tile and drywall. Emily's answers were fragmented. She and her younger sister Megan had just returned home after dinner with friends. They had expected to find their mother Laura winding down her evening. Instead, they had stepped into a scene straight from their nightmares. Tears, trembling, an eerie sense of unreality, it all came tumbling through the line. The dispatcher offered calm, steady instructions, desperate to steady the girls as she waited for the lights and sirens to cut through the night outside their front window, a beacon of help racing toward a family in distress. The suspicious scene. As the flashing red and blue lights washed over the quiet neighborhood, police officers pushed through the front door of the Evans home with purpose and dread. The girls, shell-shocked and pale, stood by the staircase, barely able to speak. Upstairs, the bathroom door hung open, revealing a scene that seemed, at first glance, surreally calm. Laura Evans, 43, lay motionless in the bathtub, her face ghostly beneath the harsh bathroom light. The air was heavy with the sharp tang of disinfectant and something deeper, an unsettling stillness, as if the room itself were holding its breath. The tub was full, water ominously still, Laura's clothes neatly stacked on a bench nearby. 2 empty vodka bottles stood on the counter, their labels glinting, and nearby, several blister packs of painkillers sat half-used. But nothing looked ransacked. The open hall closet was tidy. Personal items, a watch, a wedding ring, a journal, remained just where they belonged. There were no signs of forced entry. No shattered windows, no pried open door, no scratch marks on the locks. In fact, the house appeared almost too ordinary. Downstairs, dinner dishes sat crusting in the sink, family photos smiled from the walls, the dog barked nervously at passing strangers from behind a baby gate. But to detectives, the very normality felt suspicious. They exchanged looks in the sterile light, noting the absence of struggle. No upturned rugs, no scattered belongings, not even a faint bruise on Laura's visible skin. The home's silence, punctuated occasionally by a distant sob or the bark of the family dog, settled over everything. In the bathroom, their expert eyes scanned for clues, a smudge, a hair, droplets on the floor. Nothing was out of place. An accident, perhaps? But seasoned officers had gut instincts honed by years confronting the unexpected. Why the neatness? Why the untouched valuables? Was the bathtub simply a tragic stage for a woman outmatched by her vices? Or could something far darker have unfolded in these walls? That night, as Laura's body was respectfully prepared for transfer by the coroner, the neighborhood's usual sense of safety was replaced by prickling suspicion. Standing at the threshold of the pristine bathroom, one detective finally murmured the thought on everyone's mind, "Nothing about this adds up." And as they began the painstaking collection of evidence, it was clear this case would demand a hard look beyond the ordinary, into secrets that even the quietest homes might hide. The victim's history. Linda Evans's life reads much like a tapestry woven with resilience, hope, and a heartbreaking succession of setbacks. Born in the late 1950s in a modest suburb just outside Indianapolis, Indiana, she spent her early years in the familiar rhythm of Midwestern America: school bus rides, block parties, humid summers, and an endless ocean of cornfields surrounding her childhood home. From an early age, Linda was known as a bright student and a loyal friend. Her teachers remembered her laugh and her quick wit, while her family praised her resourcefulness and sense of duty. Her parents, both factory workers, had little, but made home a place filled with warmth and possibility. Linda dreamed not of fame but of stability and belonging. She earned her accounting certification at a local community college, then took up work as a bookkeeper for small businesses, always careful with numbers, always aware of how quickly fortune could shift for people like her. Marriage arrived in her 20s. She fell head over heels for Tom Evans, a charming, soft-spoken man who worked at a car dealership. Together, they moved to a quiet suburb outside Chicago, seeking a fresh start and a safe haven to raise a family. In the years that followed, Linda gave birth to 3 children, 2 girls, Sarah and Becky, and a son, Michael. Linda threw herself into motherhood much as she had everything else in her life, with determination, energy, and an endless well of love. But life proved far from simple. Tom's sporadic employment and mounting personal struggles, exacerbated by addiction and infidelity, sent tremors through their home. The marriage, once bright with possibility, devolved into nights of tense silence and unspoken disappointments. Eventually Tom left, sometimes resurfacing with promises of support but more often disappearing for months at a time, leaving Linda alone to keep the household afloat. Being a single mother of 3 in suburban Illinois is never easy, but for Linda, the weight felt crushing. She worked multiple part-time jobs, from preparing taxes in the spring to picking up shifts at a late-night diner, just to cover rent and groceries. The gnawing stress eroded her health, and friends noticed she became quieter, more withdrawn, and distracted by a perpetual fatigue. Despite these struggles, Linda continued to advocate fiercely for her children. She was a fixture at school events, sitting in the back row at every recital and football game, signing permission slips and teachers' notes late into the night. When money allowed, she'd splurge on small joys: a movie night, pizza delivery after a rough week, second-hand bicycles fixed up in the garage. Behind her perseverance, though, Linda battled her own shadows. The relentless pressure and emotional wounds left her vulnerable to periods of deep depression. She began to rely on alcohol as a way to numb her exhaustion and loneliness. By the time Sarah and Becky reached their teenage years, Linda's drinking had become a regular feature of household life, a source of tension and argument, but also of quiet, unspoken pain. Still, to neighbors and acquaintances, she remained outwardly functional, even friendly. "Just doing my best," she'd say with a tired smile, bags under her eyes betraying restless nights. Those who looked closer sometimes caught glimpses of something amiss: an empty gaze at the grocery store, a short temper at parent-teacher meetings, bruises she brushed off as accidents. But no one, not even her closest confidants, truly understood the storms raging inside her home. Linda's story is one of quiet courage, and ultimately the tragic limitations of endurance. Her life, stitched together by love for her children and dogged hope for a better tomorrow, is also a cautionary tale about the invisible burdens parents can bear, and how even unremarkable families can harbor turmoil and secrets just beyond anyone's notice. The mystery of Linda. As dawn crept through the chilly streets of suburban New York, a thick, palpable uncertainty lingered in the Evans household. For those first days after Linda's death, her absence was like an open wound, raw, inexplicable, and strangely silent. The world around the family seemed to hum along with business as usual. Neighbors stringing up winter decorations, children crunching across icy sidewalks. But inside the home, the air was heavy with unanswered questions, whispers that refused to be silenced by simple explanations. On paper, Linda Evans's death seemed tragically straightforward. A single mother, clearly overwhelmed by the pressures of life, her struggle with alcohol well known even among acquaintances. At a glance it was easy for investigators, and even her closest friends, to accept the theory of accidental drowning fueled by too much vodka and a handful of painkillers. Yet beneath that apparent simplicity, there were threads that didn't quite tie together. Suspicion began with the crime scene itself. The bathroom was almost unnaturally clean. No signs of struggle, nothing broken or askew. The prescription painkillers by the tub appeared to have been touched, but not in a desperate or chaotic manner, almost as if someone had meticulously staged the scene or cleaned up after the fact. Investigators couldn't help but wonder, was it possible that Linda's final moments weren't entirely her own? Linda's personal history only added to the mystery. She'd spent most of her adult life walking a precarious tightrope, juggling demanding jobs, navigating the emotional fallout of a failed marriage and an abusive second relationship, managing her children's needs while her own mental resilience quietly withered. Friends recalled their last conversations with Linda, many remembering a woman who was both deeply exhausted and weirdly optimistic, who spoke of starting over after so much loss. She'd even recently purchased new curtains for the living room, a small gesture, but for Linda, a sign she hadn't given in to total despair. Yet, there were also rumors that Linda was harboring secrets. She'd been unusually withdrawn in her final weeks, her phone calls brief, her responses vague. Some neighbors remembered passing her on the street and noticing the hurried, distracted way she clutched her grocery bags or glanced nervously over her shoulder. The local pharmacist recalled Linda asking if a particular combination of pills and alcohol could cause trouble, a question he brushed off as a joke at the time. The children, too, whispered among themselves. Sarah, the oldest, had confided in a school counselor that she felt trapped at home, while Becky had grown quiet, less rambunctious than her friends remembered. Michael, the youngest, started sleepwalking for the first time since preschool. The entire family's routines shifted. Linda began locking her bedroom and bathroom door, something she'd never done before. Then came the financial questions. Linda had recently taken out a new life insurance policy with a substantial payout in the event of accidental death. More than one neighbor wondered aloud how she could afford the premiums on her modest salary, especially given her weekly spending on alcohol and ongoing legal fees related to her ex-husband. The policy notably named her daughters as the primary beneficiaries, a fact that would later become a central point of tension and a source of potential motive others would question. Community gossip simmered about the Evans children's increasingly defiant attitudes at school and their growing circle of older, possibly troubled friends. Rumors spread that Sarah had been caught stealing from a local pharmacy. Becky was spotted more than once sneaking out late at night or coming home in a taxi, her eyes bloodshot. The police began combing through phone records and social media, tracing cryptic conversations among the siblings and their acquaintances. A barrage of inside jokes, song lyrics, and coded messages that seemed to hint at deeper rifts, unspoken grievances, and even long-held resentments simmering beneath the surface. For the detectives assigned to the case, the absence of evidence became its own kind of evidence, raising more questions than it answered. Why would a woman so battered by life yet evidently not without hope suddenly give up? Was Linda Evans truly a victim of circumstance, or was there something or someone nudging her toward the brink? Even her closest friends struggled to reconcile memories of her resilience with the abrupt, inglorious finality of her death. Was her end a cry for help gone unheeded, or was it a tragedy carefully orchestrated from the shadows? The forensic reports compounded the uncertainty. While nothing pointed fully to foul play, no bloody fingerprints, no defensive wounds, no obvious tampering with the toxic mix of vodka and pills, the total lack of physical struggle was uncanny. A seasoned coroner described it as too peaceful, as though Linda had gone willingly or worse, been rendered incapable of resisting what happened. Yet the toxicology numbers almost defied belief, far beyond what a person might casually ingest, even in the darkest throes of despair. Investigators quietly wondered, had Linda been alone in taking those doses, or had someone else measured and administered them for her? As days passed, grief in the Evans household became laced with suspicion. Strategy meetings between law enforcement and social workers grew tense. The children's stories, when recounted, were tinged with subtle but significant inconsistencies. Neighbors began to keep their distance, unconsciously closing themselves off from the family. A strange chill seemed to settle on the community, as if everyone sensed a storm brewing just out of sight. To this day, the real mystery of Linda Evans is not simply how she died, but why. Was she the author of her own fate, a strong woman finally overwhelmed by the relentless grind of survival and heartbreak? Or was there someone, perhaps within the four walls she once called home, who ensured that her story ended beneath the surface of a cold, shallow bath? The truth, as it unraveled piece by piece, was more layered, sad, and haunting than the community could ever have believed. Bitter past. Linda Evans's past was colored by shades of longing, struggle, and the relentless ticking of time, not the glamorous adversity that made for page-turning memoirs, but the kind of quiet, grinding hardship that goes largely unnoticed except by those who live it. Born in a faded neighborhood on the outskirts of Madison, Indiana, Linda's earliest memories were shaped by the muffled sounds of her parents fighting behind closed doors and the sweet relief of summer breezes sneaking in through her bedroom window. Financial security always danced just out of reach. Her father worked maintenance at the local factory. Her mother cleaned houses for families whose lives seemed impossibly stable from a distance. Linda quickly learned that dreams required more than hope. They needed resilience. In her teenage years, after her father's sudden illness left him unable to work, Linda took on a series of after-school jobs, bagging groceries, babysitting the neighbors' kids, scrubbing the floors in the local bakery just to bring in a handful of dollars each week. Her mother's stoic endurance seeped into her bones, but so did the aching loneliness of responsibility carried too early. The future she imagined for herself, one where she might go out of state for college or backpack through Europe, shrunk into a single pounding truth. She couldn't leave her family behind. After graduating high school with solid but unremarkable grades, Linda enrolled at a local community college. She studied accounting, drawn to the safety of numbers, the comfort of equations that added up where the rest of her life didn't. It was around this time that she met Tom Evans, recently discharged from the Army and brimming with charm. Tom promised adventure, security, and a love that would eclipse her fears. In their whirlwind courtship, Linda was swept up by the feeling, so foreign, so intoxicating, of being chosen. But fairy tales are fragile things. Linda and Tom wed quietly in the local Methodist church, a modest ceremony attended by barely 24 family members and friends. For a while, Linda dared to believe her story was changing. Together, they rented a tiny apartment, saved pennies in a coffee tin for a down payment, and dreamed of someday buying the little white cottage on Maple Street. Children soon followed, a baby girl, then 2 years later, a second daughter, and finally, a son whose arrival seemed both blessing and burden. What Linda hadn't bargained for were the slow creeping patterns of disappointment familiar from her childhood. Tom, after a handful of promising jobs, struggled to hold steady work. Restlessness gave way to late nights spent drinking at the local bar, laughter between them turning brittle and infrequent. Their bills grew faster than Tom's paychecks. Arguments over money crackled through the apartment, echoing the resentments of Linda's own parents. The hope she'd clung to started to feel threadbare. Still, Linda pressed on, unwilling to admit to friends or even herself how far the reality of marriage had drifted from her dreams. In these years of quiet desperation, Linda discovered the numbing efficiency of self-sacrifice. She worked part-time jobs, preparing taxes in the spring, cashiering at a 24-hour gas station, folding laundry at the laundromat on weekends, to keep the family afloat. The effort was Herculean and invisible, rarely acknowledged by Tom and mostly unnoticed by the world. Sometimes she would pause, aching for the past version of herself who believed in happy endings, but necessity never allowed her to linger long. Her friends from high school, drifting away in their own orbits, saw her less and less. Even when they did meet for coffee, Linda would offer a warm smile and insist everything was fine. Tom's sudden departure was less a thunderclap than an unraveling. Late-night absences became days, then weeks, and finally months. Linda, ever pragmatic, stopped expecting him to walk back through the door. His infrequent phone calls, usually to request money or make hollow promises, brought more pain than comfort. The reality of single motherhood came down on her with barely any warning: 3 children to feed, a landlord demanding rent, and a refrigerator that always seemed too empty. The years that followed were marked by relentless, exhausting effort. Linda rarely slept through the night. Anxiety gnawed at her as she shuttled between jobs, dropped the kids at school, bargained with utility companies to stave off another shut-off notice. Her body gave subtle warnings: persistent headaches, a tremor in her hands, a sense of fatigue that never quite dissipated. Still she kept going, driven less by any grand vision than by the simple, stubborn refusal to let her children grow up hungry or ashamed. Resilience, bittersweet as it was, became Linda's only currency. Each day was an act of survival, but each day also carved away at her dreams. When well-meaning neighbors commented on what a strong woman she was, Linda forced a tired smile. Inside she was wilting, thread by thread. Her greatest wounds, though, were invisible. Linda's sense of self-worth was battered by years of being told she wasn't enough, first by Tom, then by the cold impersonality of government forms and employer rejections. Even as she tried to shield her children from the worst of their circumstances, they noticed her fraying patience, the way her laughter changed, and how the lines around her eyes deepened. Linda's few moments of happiness became precious and rare. She loved baking cookies with her youngest, watching sitcoms late at night in the glow of the television, or hearing her eldest daughter recount a minor triumph at school. She found solace in small victories: a slightly larger grocery haul, a paid-off credit card, a thank-you note from a teacher. These moments anchored her, even as the weight of her bitter past threatened daily to pull her under. Living with an old wound. Linda Evans's daily existence became an exercise in carrying the weight of unseen wounds, so much so that her life blurred into a kind of silent endurance, where pain was woven into the mundane rituals of ordinary days. After her escape from the turmoil of David's abuse, the fabric of her family had been shredded in ways almost impossible to mend. The house, once a place with echoes of childish laughter and the comforting predictability of schedules, now felt shadowed, haunted by memories too difficult to confront. She passed her days in a state of muted anticipation, always waiting for another outburst, a slam of the door, or a phone call that would bring more bad news. Even in quiet moments, Linda could feel the scars across her psyche: the sudden tightening in her chest when a car backfired outside, the instinct to apologize for things she hadn't done, or her near-constant vigilance when navigating crowded grocery store aisles. The trauma, once acute, had become chronic, settling into her bones and muscles in ways she couldn't quite articulate, even to herself. Her daughters bore their own share of invisible injuries. Becky no longer trusted the gentle hug of a loved one, and Sarah flinched at loud voices. At school conferences, Linda watched teachers look at her with a mixture of sympathy and discomfort, as if they grasped at the edges of her story but couldn't, or wouldn't, ask the questions that mattered. The children's grades slid, and their laughter became brittle, rarely filling the house as it once had. Each of them became experts in hiding. Hiding scars, hiding anger, hiding the desperation that crept in after midnight when the darkness pressed in too close. And then there was the town. Willow Springs was not a place that forgave easily nor forgot quickly. Word of the Evans family's trouble spread, first in whispers, then in outright speculation. Linda found herself shrinking beneath the gaze of neighbors, hearing them comment on her drinking problem in the aisles of the corner market, feeling the subtle ostracism that came with being marked by scandal. Few offered real help, most offered advice she didn't need, or worse, pity she despised. The isolation became a second layer of injury, reinforcing the message that she and her children were now outsiders. Linda's attempts to rebuild often felt pathetic, even to her. She would scrub the kitchen for hours to distract herself, organize old photographs with the hope of conjuring even a fleeting sense of normalcy. The refrigerator was papered with school permission slips, overdue bills, and sticky notes reminding her of things she could barely manage. Parent-teacher nights, counseling appointments, grocery lists written in shaky handwriting. There were times, as she sat alone at the breakfast table, that she simply stared into space, unable to recall what it felt like to move through life without bracing for the next storm. The scars of betrayal from David's violence and the community's neglect left Linda doubting her own worth as a mother and as a human being. She agonized over every sharp word she delivered in exhaustion, every moment she pulled away instead of offering comfort, every time she reached for another glass of vodka to numb the ache inside her. Shame was a companion as loyal as her own shadow, looming, intemperate, inescapable, and yet, every morning, she pressed on, propelled by a stubborn hope that something might be salvaged from the ruins. Every interaction with her children was tinged by the consequences of their shared past. Linda sometimes caught herself scrutinizing their faces, desperate to read what went unspoken, resentment, disappointment, or worse, the same defeat she felt. She tried to compensate with gentle gestures, a favorite meal, a new set of markers for Becky, extra minutes before bedtime for Sarah, but nothing truly mended the invisible chasms. The girls in turn became wary, mastering the art of silence. Michael, ever her little shadow, stopped asking when Daddy would come home. Therapy was suggested repeatedly by well-meaning social workers and the occasional teacher, but attendance waxed and waned. On damp Monday afternoons, Linda and the kids would sit in the chilly waiting room, flipping through out-of-date magazines, dreading the stale smell of institutional carpet and the slow tick of the second hand on the wall clock. The counselors seemed young and earnest, but always distant, their platitudes offering little comfort in the face of pain so raw it throbbed beneath the surface of daily life. To outsiders, the Evans home may have appeared unremarkable. 4 walls, flower beds out front, the occasional toy left on the stoop. But inside, every hallway carried echoes of fear and regret, and every meal was tinged with unease. Linda's anger, a thing she had once hidden, sometimes erupted, first as passive disappointment, then as sharp, uncharacteristic outbursts that startled even herself. The girls responded with sullen silence or tearful retreats, while Michael would disappear to the backyard, digging holes in the cold, wet earth. On rare good days, Linda tried to believe that healing was possible. She would banish the alcohol, cook dinner from scratch, sit with her children through old family photo albums and listen, really listen, to their stories about school or friends. For a fleeting moment, hope flickered that maybe time could soften the old wounds, that the future could be rewritten, if only in small, steady increments. But more often, the inertia of the past, the relentless tide of memory and old hurt, would drag her back. Linda's life grew smaller as the months passed. She stopped calling old friends and let invitations languish unanswered. Shopping at the grocery store became a gauntlet of forced smiles and downcast eyes, a test of her resolve to appear normal for the benefit of others. At church, she sat in the back pew, eyes fixed on the curling edges of the hymnal, praying for forgiveness she wasn't sure she deserved. The holidays were worst. The bright cheer of Christmas lights and the booming joy of neighborhood barbecues only amplified her sense of isolation. Yet there was a peculiar courage in Linda's endurance, a stubborn, resilient core that refused to surrender entirely. Every morning, no matter how sleepless the night, she dragged herself from bed, steeled herself against the day ahead, and tried. Even her failures, her relapses, her mistrust, her moments of overwhelming grief, were evidence that she had not given up. She was not, she insisted to herself, entirely broken. There was still some part of her fighting for her children, for redemption, for the faintest glimmer of peace. That fight, though invisible to many, cost Linda dearly. She sometimes fantasized about running away, starting over somewhere her past couldn't find her. There were days she scrolled through classified ads for out-of-state jobs, pausing on descriptions for waitresses in warm southern towns, or cashiers in dusty Arizona diners. But every time, responsibility snapped her back. Her children needed her, unfinished bills demanded payment, and the weight of obligation always pressed her firmly into place. There were sleepless nights when Linda replayed every mistake in her mind, wondering if choosing differently years ago would have made any of this easier. She thought of her own mother and father, the ways they had failed her, and the ways she was failing her children in turn. Cycles, she thought bitterly. Some families never escape them. Still, she taped up broken kitchen chairs, patched hand-me-down clothes with neat stitches, and taught her kids to say please and thank you, hoping small efforts mattered in the grand, unmoving scheme of things. Sometimes she caught brief, unguarded moments of softness in the girls, a quiet good night, or the way Sarah carefully tucked the blanket around Michael. Those small mercies were little islands of grace in an ocean of regret. She clung to them desperately, letting them fortify her enough to carry on through the next rough patch. Yet, Linda could not ignore the toll her trauma took on her body and spirit. The headaches grew more frequent, her back stiffened, and her hands sometimes shook so badly she thought she might drop the whole dinner pan. A doctor suggested antidepressants, but she never filled the prescription. Instead, she measured out her solace in ounces of vodka at night, hiding the bottles behind canned beans and broken blender parts so the kids wouldn't find them. She knew it was no solution, just a delaying tactic against despair. Years blurred and routines solidified. Wake up, shuffle the kids to school, work, cook, clean, try not to think. The past never left her, not truly. But Linda kept moving, if not forward, then at least not backward. That, in its way, was survival. And though the wounds she and her children carried would never truly fade, she still nursed the cautious, battered hope that the future might hold something, anything, kinder than what they had already endured. Layers upon layers of tragedy. In the months that followed David's conviction and Linda's desperate attempts to shield her children, the Evans household transformed from a haven of strained hope to a sorrow-filled cage. What might have once been ordinary daily struggles now ballooned into relentless overlapping catastrophes, each one less visible to the outside world than the last. In time, the family stopped expecting relief to come from anywhere beyond those tired, creaking walls. Every corner of the small house bore silent witness to Linda's unraveling. There were the bruised knuckles, evidence of her anger channeled at squeaky cabinet doors or the chipped banister, never at her children. The faint metallic scent of stale alcohol clung to the plush armchair where she sometimes dozed fully clothed, covered by a faded blanket she once sewed for Michael's nursery. Laundry, once neatly contained to baskets, began to spill across the floor like so much unspoken pain. The children exchanged furtive glances at the dinner table, learning to read their mother's moods through the tightness around her eyes and the hurried, almost obsessive way she organized and reorganized unpaid bills. Beneath the surface rituals of life, meals, homework, the Sunday evening haircuts, lurked a perpetual state of emergency. The electricity was cut off twice during one cold winter month, plunging the house into darkness and forcing Linda to light a series of mismatched candles that flickered ominously in the damp kitchen. When the water heater went out, she washed dishes with cold water, her hands numb and red, refusing to ask for help from neighbors who already looked at her with a mix of pity and suspicion. The children, too, learned to absorb disappointment with practiced silence. Sarah's grades slipped. Becky started skipping after-school activities, unwilling to leave her mother and brother alone for too long. Michael, whose world had always revolved around his sisters, became withdrawn and jumpy, startled by loud sounds or sudden changes in routine. In the absence of reassurance, the siblings formed their own truce, an alliance bound by fear, yearning, and a collective wish for relief, however impossible it seemed. The specter of David's violence and the cruelty of small-town gossip lingered long after the headlines faded. Even as Linda did her best to smother rumors, she saw the sidelong glances in the grocery aisles, heard the breathy snickers behind the wheel of the school bus, whispered accusations about what kind of mother let this happen or who drinks that much with kids in the house, chipped away at what little confidence she had left. She stopped attending PTA meetings, then church, then eventually community events altogether. At home, loneliness and shame became her constant companions, manifesting not just in vodka bottles hidden in laundry baskets, but in her avoidance of mirrors and her refusal to answer the phone after dusk. To the outside world, the Evans family was shrouded in an aura of quiet disaster, a place where the porch light flickered at odd intervals and laughter, if it surfaced at all, sounded hollow. The yard went untended, weeds pressing triumphantly through cracks in the walkway, and toys left scattered for weeks were slowly swallowed by the grass. Visitors became rare. The mail carrier paused only briefly when approaching their porch, sometimes delivering shut-off notices with a whispered prayer. With no support system left, Linda's attempts at normalcy became almost ritualistic. She would scrub floors late into the night, chasing a sense of control, her mind racing with guilt over things she couldn't fix. She feared becoming a monster in her children's eyes, even though she loved them fiercely. Her patience thinned, and her voice sometimes cut sharper than intended in the middle of yet another argument sparked by small offenses: unwashed dishes, untidied bedrooms, grades that slipped from B to C. No one dared raise the real questions, like why Michael wet the bed again or why Sarah sometimes refused to eat breakfast. The isolation deepened a sense of generational repetition. Linda's own childhood had been marked by adult arguments and the ever-present threat of disappointment, and as much as she tried to shield her family, the pattern seemed inescapable. She noticed it in her daughter's slumped postures, in their avoidance of friends, and in their brittle, forced attempts at defiance. The family that had once clung together through each new crisis now drifted apart, each member carving out a private world of grief. For Linda, Each day became a tightrope walk suspended over a chasm of regret and fatigue. She would stare, unmoving, out the rain-streaked window for long stretches. The memories of David's rage and Tom's abandonment gnawed at her resolve. On the worst days, she would pour herself a drink before noon, a small act of self-betrayal that left her nauseous with shame, but unable to stop. Even the comfort of letters from her estranged sister, or the rare visit from a sympathetic social worker, began to seem like reminders of her failures, rather than lifelines out of despair. Financial stress loomed everywhere. Linda patched up their aging sedan with duct tape, haggled with utility companies, and clipped coupons in hope of stretching each paycheck a little further. She sold off wedding china and heirlooms for bills, crying quietly afterward. Even birthdays and holidays became reminders of what had been lost. Presents, when there were any, were cheap and practical, smuggled from thrift stores and wrapped with old newspaper comics. The children knew better than to ask for more. And then, there was the relentless onslaught of memory. Linda found herself haunted by visions, sometimes literal, sometimes metaphorical, of what life could have been if only one variable were different. If she had left Tom sooner, if David had never entered their lives, if she had trusted just one more friend. Every family photo became a museum artifact, evidence of a happiness that was always conditional and fleeting. On sleepless nights, she sat alone in the dim light, scrolling through old phone messages she was too afraid to delete. The ache of nostalgia blurred with the sting of guilt, and sleep became both a refuge and a punishment, filled with dreams that always soured before morning. The outside world, of course, kept moving. Willow Springs celebrated festivals, reopened schools after winter storms, posted news about upcoming concerts and local elections. The Evans family, however, remained stuck, fixed in the town's collective memory as both ruined and dangerous, a symbol of what can go wrong when tragedy compounds rather than heals. Even those who pitied Linda hesitated to offer help, fearing entanglement with a legacy of sorrow that felt bottomless. There were small, scattered moments when hope made a valiant, if brief, stand. Sometimes Linda choked back tears long enough to sing to Michael or to help Sarah with her homework. Becky would find her mother weeping in the kitchen and sit silently beside her, a gesture of solidarity that needed no words. But even these fleeting connections were fragile, crumbs along a path that always seemed to implode beneath their feet. The repetition of hardship bred resignation more than resilience. The family learned not to expect rescue, and when brief reprieves came, an unexpected grant from the church, a neighbor's casserole, gratitude was edged with disbelief. Ultimately, the tragedies that layered themselves onto the Evans family did not arrive neatly or sequentially. They struck in unpredictable, overlapping patterns, each new hardship erasing the promise of recovery from the last. As Linda aged before her time, her hands roughened by bleach and labor, she held her children closer, even as her grip weakened. She understood, in her clearest moments, that survival was as much an act of rebellion as it was one of endurance. The outside world might write her off as a casualty of addiction or circumstance, but Linda knew the truth. Her life, and those of her children, were a patchwork of scars and small, fierce acts of love, stitched together in the face of relentless, multiplying sorrow. The case that seemed closed. For months after Linda Evans's death, silence settled uneasily over her old neighborhood. Willow Springs gossiped in low voices about the tragedy, but with the initial shock fading and Linda's children gone to live with their aunt, the world seemed eager to let the story rest in peace. The authorities, after many interviews and a maze of paperwork, had closed their file with the official explanation: accidental death, complicated by chronic alcoholism. Social services ticked off their checklists, the press rolled on to fresher scandals, and the Evans home slipped quietly into a new chapter defined by absence. To outsiders it seemed almost merciful that the children had been relocated. The house, once a crucible of stress and sorrow, now stood empty, a faded for sale sign slowly tilting on the frostbitten lawn. But for those who cared to look closer, questions flickered in the half-light, whispers about the girls' strange composure at their mother's funeral, or the way neighbors remembered Linda's frazzled face peering out from behind her curtains during those final weeks. Still, nothing tangible broke through the official narrative, and so the story ossified, a lonely woman lost to her demons, another family ruined by circumstance. In legal records, her children were classified as victims as much as orphans. They carried the weight of what happened into each new setting. Becky sulked in her aunt's kitchen, refusing to unpack, while Sarah withdrew into herself, breaking off gentle attempts at conversation with a twist of the head or a hollow stare. Michael, always the most fragile, started stuttering again and needed a nightlight. Their lives, now etched with loss, adjusted to the rhythms of another household, another set of rules, each day measured by the clock hands crawling through a new, unfamiliar home. The insurance payout Linda had secured meant their material needs were met. Tuition could be paid, new shoes purchased, a sense of security restored in ways Linda never could afford while alive. But money offered cold comfort. At every family gathering, relatives eyed the trio with a mix of pity and reverence, whispering about all they'd been through. The girls bristled under scrutiny. Michael, especially, shrank from contact, clutching his mother's old scarf when he thought no one was looking. In photographs from this time, none of the children were smiling, their eyes ringed with shadows that never entirely faded. Time marched on, as it always does. Winter faded to spring, and with it, the physical remnants of the Evans tragedy were slowly erased. The house was sold to a couple from out of state. Becky's old friends made awkward overtures at the new school, only to retreat when met with sullen indifference. The small-town rumor mill sputtered and finally fell silent, the once juicy tale replaced by newer dramas. Linda's memory receded until, for many, she became just another cautionary tale about the dangers lurking behind closed suburban doors. Yet cracks had formed beneath the surface. Sarah, now a junior in high school, ran with an older crowd, her grades slipping as fast as her patience. Becky became unpredictable, alternating between wild outbursts and glassy silence. In therapy, they brushed away questions about their mother's last day, always repeating the same rehearsed lines. She had been drunk, she fell asleep, they found her too late. Each answer seemed true and practiced at once, shot through with a tension the counselors could not quite penetrate. Their aunt, pragmatic and guarded, did her best. She kept them fed, clothed, and on schedule, issuing rules with military precision. But she was not Linda, and on bad nights the old wounds reopened, shouting matches over curfews, silent meals, slammed doors. The children's trauma was a heavy fog, drifting through each room, invisible but undeniable. Sometimes Becky would stand in the hallway outside her aunt's bedroom, listening for signs of movement, afraid of the silence, afraid perhaps of her own thoughts. But with the case all but forgotten, the quiet began to unravel in unexpected ways. A school counselor noticed Sarah's increasingly reckless behavior, a suspension for cheating, rumors of shoplifting at a local convenience store, whispered complaints about her aunt's stricter house rules. Becky, meanwhile, was caught with cigarettes and a flask stolen from her late mother's belongings, protesting with a defiance that was brittle rather than bold. Michael's fits of tears always at night resumed. He refused to talk about his mother at all, and instead developed a morbid interest in detective stories. Linda's sister tried to hold the children together, blaming their troubles on grief. She met with school officials and therapists, attended parent-teacher meetings and group counseling, desperate for a fix, any fix, that would chase away the growing darkness. When the psychologist suggested that unresolved guilt or trauma might be at play, she bristled. "We've done everything right. They just need time." Still, as the weeks unspooled, she found herself checking the locks more often, locking away prescription medications and staying up late scrolling through the girls' social media for any hints of trouble. Sometimes she caught Becky crying on the porch, or Sarah staring out at the empty street, lost in thought. The real turning point didn't come with a bang, but with a whisper. It had been almost a year, a cycle of birthdays, holidays, school dances come and gone. Then out of nowhere, a nervous acquaintance of Sarah's approached a school officer, hands trembling, with a story that sent chills through the department. "I think something's not right. There's things they said about their mom. Things you should know." At first the officer wanted to write it off as teenage drama, kids acting out, stretching the truth. But there were details in the confession that didn't match the official file. Descriptions of what Linda looked like that night, how pills were arranged near the tub, and words repeated by the sisters that never made it to the coroner's report. As whispers became statements, as fragments from Becky's and Sarah's friends were collected and cross-checked, the case file was quietly reopened. The children, who had slipped into a new pattern of life, suddenly found their world spinning out of control once more. The police returned to old interviews, scrutinizing every timeline, every word. They sat down again with Linda's sister, this time with an edge to their questions. Investigators pored over texts from the family's old phones, social media posts and messages between the girls and a shadowy circle of friends. Patterns emerged. strange late-night conversations, shared links about insurance payouts, and, most chillingly, digital footprints suggesting the sisters had researched methods of inducing overdose in the months before Linda's death. Detectives interviewed schoolmates, neighbors, and even the pharmacist who remembered Linda's uneasy questions about pills and alcohol. Each recalled something odd, a flippant remark, a joke about death, a whispered secret behind gymnasium doors. Friends hesitated to betray Sarah and Becky, but as more hints piled up, loyalty crumbled beneath the weight of fear and obligation. "They said their mom would be better off gone," one friend whispered. "They said it'd be a relief, that everything would change." As the puzzle came together, prosecutors faced their own dilemma. The children, now almost adults, had always been considered victims, their suffering unquestioned. To flip the frame and see them as suspects required a level of care and precision few had anticipated. Psychological experts were called, sifting through transcripts and behavioral evaluations to determine whether trauma had warped the girl's judgment, or if something darker, resentment, calculation, a desperate bid for freedom, had guided their actions. Linda's own story, once filed away as a sad but simple tragedy, was now the focal point of a potential crime. Questions multiplied. Had her painkiller prescriptions been tampered with? Had anyone else been present the night she died? Or had evidence been wiped away before authorities arrived? The family's inner circle shrank as suspicion spread. Old friends stopped calling. Church members whispered prayers for the lost souls at the root of such a mystery. At one point, a local journalist caught wind of the investigation. Within days, headlines reignited interest in the Evans case, framing it as a classic American saga of hidden despair and sensational twists. Reporters camped outside the family's new home, pored through court filings, and speculated wildly about motives, methods, and the legacy of generational trauma. For the children, now thrust back into a harsh spotlight, the wounds of the past became fresh again. Throughout all this, one comment from Linda's best friend echoed with haunting clarity. Everyone thought the case was closed, but no story ever ends until every question is answered, and sometimes the answers are worse than anyone imagined. By now, the town of Willow Springs had moved on, eager to paper over the pain beneath new coats of paint, new families moving in, new stories unfolding. But the Evans family's legacy of heartbreak, suspicion, and the dreadful possibility that love can curdle into something unrecognizable remained a shadow across the old neighborhood, a reminder that closure is often a fragile, temporary illusion. Cold-blooded conspiracy. The chill of true betrayal doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It creeps in slowly, like frost inching across a window pane, turning once warm spaces frigid without warning. In the Evans household, where tragedy had already painted the walls with shadows, something far colder than grief began to settle. A cunning, deliberate malice that would stun even the most hardened investigators when uncovered. The icy calculation behind Linda's death, once unthinkable, emerged through a web of secrets, digital footprints, and confessions that revealed not just a crime, but a conspiracy painstakingly woven by her own daughters, Sarah and Becky. The story began to unravel with the discovery of incriminating audio recordings stored on an old, half-broken mobile phone that belonged to Becky. Law enforcement, initially combing through the family's electronics for routine follow-up, stumbled upon fragmented voice memos, whispered conversations that, when pieced together, told a story so starkly chilling it felt lifted from the pages of a psychological thriller. The sisters, in shaky voices, discussed late-night plans, timing, and substances, always careful, but never expert enough to erase every trace. Yet, it was not just technology that betrayed them. Friends, drawn in by a mixture of guilt and fear, stepped forward with scraps of undeniable testimony. It wasn't a single, spontaneous act born in a flash of anger. The narrative slowly shifted from the classic image of desperate, traumatized children to something deeply more uncomfortable. A deliberate, cold-blooded scheme fostered by years of festering resentment, financial anxiety, and the toxic cocktail of adolescence gone astray. Statements collected from classmates and confidants painted a disturbing portrait. Sarah and Becky had, over months, exchanged notes and online messages, not just venting frustration or hopelessness, but actively researching methods for ending a life that had, in their eyes, become an unbearable obstacle. Their motivations were not straightforward. Investigators, poring over journals and intercepted messages, saw patterns of conflicted rationale, a heartbreaking mixture of misplaced vengeance, a yearning for freedom, and even an adolescent belief that removing their mother would solve all of their problems. To Sarah, the oldest, Linda was both caretaker and jailer, the root of every indignity suffered during high school: missed dances due to lack of money, second-hand clothes, whispers about alcohol-fueled arguments heard through thin apartment walls. Becky, less overtly rebellious but equally angry, internalized her mother's pain as a burden she herself should not have to bear. Yet, even when their thoughts crossed lines most teenagers only flirt with in passing, neither girl made a move, until the cruel alchemy of opportunity and desperation aligned. Linda, in her last months, had slipped deeper into dependency on alcohol and painkillers. Her body weakened, her spirit clearly battered. The bills piled high, the threat of eviction became real, the whisper of a life insurance policy, enough if something were to happen to free them from their downward spiral, became seed and spark alike. But what turned resentment into action was not just greed or anger. It was, in part, the subtle, corrosive influence of others, older friends who joked about easy ways out, online forums glorifying boldness and cunning, a culture that sometimes idolized escape at any cost. The girls didn't merely act in isolation, they were prodded, encouraged, and egged on in small but crucial ways. Group chats became safe havens for fantasy and planning. Sarah's boyfriend, a brooding, manipulative dropout with a penchant for true crime, offered suggestions laced with dark humor, daring her to be ruthless. Becky confided in a close friend, whose advice was less a warning and more a twisted form of validation. If you're gonna do it right, don't let her suffer, make it painless. Words that lingered. On the night in question, the stars aligned with an almost cinematic cruelty. Linda, especially loaded from an uncharacteristically large consumption of vodka and a double dose of painkillers, a combination noted in the toxicology report, was drowsy, incoherent, and unable to resist. The sisters orchestrated their actions with a disturbing calm. One ran the bath hotter than usual, the other coaxed Linda upstairs under the guise of mother-daughter time. According to later confessions, they hesitated, argued, then fell into a grim, determined silence as they moved to hold her beneath the water, their hands trembling but relentless. When it was over, the silence of the house was so complete that even the family dog hid in the corner, unwilling to bark. The next phase was quick, cleaning the scene, arranging bottles and prescription packets to suggest an accidental overdose. With unsettling attention to detail, they replaced items, wiped away stray water, and left the bathroom appearing sterile, almost peaceful. They checked timelines, rehearsed their story, and then descended as if in a trance to await the inevitable discovery. Emily, their youngest sibling and the only one left untainted by the plot, found the scene first, which helped their act. Hysterical phone calls, genuine panic, the carefully measured interplay of shock and grief. For a time it worked. Law enforcement found no overt evidence of a struggle. Toxicology pointed to self-inflicted excess. But no story is watertight. The chilling leaks began with whispers among the children's friends, comments replayed at school about finally being free, strange posts on social media hinting at a new chapter at any cost, and one panicked midnight call to a confidant in which Becky sobbed, "We did it, but I don't think I'm okay." The digital trail, too, refused to be erased. Search histories about lethal substance combinations, deleted texts warning each other to stick to their alibis, and cloud backups of those secretly recorded voice memos. By the time police, driven by an anonymous tip and mounting inconsistencies, reopened the case, the narrative of cold calculation was undeniable. Psychologists assigned to the investigation struggled to diagnose the girls, not simply as sociopaths but as damaged, reactive products of sustained trauma and social neglect. The community recoiled in disbelief. Newspapers screamed headlines comparing the Evans sisters to infamous parricides, though those closest to the family described something far less sensational and far more tragic. Girls crushed by the failures of adults on every side and driven by despair into monstrous acts they could neither fully understand nor undo. The aftermath left nothing untouched. Linda's death, once mourned as a senseless tragedy, evolved into a parable about society's responsibilities and the hidden violence simmering under placid suburban surfaces. The chilling clarity of the sisters' plot, weeks of messages, hours of whispers, the final orchestrated night, became a testament to what can curdle inside the human soul when hope is methodically denied. And while justice moved forward, the scars on the Evans family, and on every life their story touched, would remain deep, cold, and unlikely ever to fully thaw. The shocking reopening of the case. No one in Willow Springs quite anticipated just how violently the past could come roaring back. A past for many long since compartmentalized and boxed away, its jagged edges dulled by time and necessity. The Evans case, after all, had been filed, closed, and consigned to local tragedy folklore, its primary characters scattered to new lives, its mysteries allowed to fade beneath the sediment of routine. But the truth, as ever, resists burial. The first tremors were almost imperceptible. A nervous whisper during lunch period, a teacher's lingering unease at Sarah's uncharacteristic outburst, a therapy session that left a counselor with a knot of suspicion she couldn't quite shake. And then, almost with the inevitability of an avalanche, secrets began to slip from the shadows. An anonymous tip, delivered via a trembling phone call to the county hotline, did what the weight of official procedure had not. It forced the reopening of Linda Evans's death as a potential criminal investigation. The contents of that call, details known only to someone close to the family, specifics never printed in any news coverage, earned it instantaneous credibility among detectives still haunted by the case's oddities. Within weeks, a quietly assembled task force poured through the original file under new lighting, their efforts governed by tension and a sense of unspoken urgency. They sifted with almost obsessive intensity through every initial officer's report, each photograph, hospital record, and recorded statement. One investigator, known for his rigid adherence to process, couldn't help but comment aloud, "Every single note from that night carries a discordant undertone." The house, by now abandoned and emptied, became a silent archive of possible oversight. Fingerprints were rescanned, forensics revisited, and new experts brought in to audit the toxicological evidence from scratch. But it was never just about physical evidence. As the inquiry deepened, detectives began to re-interview everyone who orbited the Evans family in those despair-soaked days: neighbors, school staff, pharmacy clerks. Even the mailman remembered a delivery that seemed out of place the week before Linda's death. Accounts that had once seemed trivial, Becky's trembling voice when describing her mother's last meal, Sarah's passing reference to wishing things would just end, now rang with fresh implications. Of particular note was the uneasy composure both girls had displayed in the wake of their mother's passing. "I call it a brittle grief," recalled one teacher, her voice cracking on the record. It was as though mourning was a performance they'd rehearsed too well. School friends, once loyal and close-mouthed, started to talk when confronted with their own guilt, some reciting fragments of late-night text admissions and tear-soaked confessions. When police sifted through confiscated electronics, they found messages and deleted histories that pointed to a calculated effort to manipulate perception, timelines, and responses. A pivotal turning point came with the recovery of an old webcam backup Sarah had forgotten even existed. Within its hours of glitchy, pixelated footage were snippets of seemingly mundane family scenes, but also a handful of damning moments. Whispered strategic conversations out of reach of their younger brother, nervous laughter after their initial interviews with child welfare, cryptic phrases about keeping stories straight. Each frame lent weight to the growing body of circumstantial evidence, enough at last for the district attorney to authorize a full-blown homicide investigation and to issue subpoenas demanding further cooperation from a now wary extended family. For those closest to the Evans siblings, the slow surfacing of the potential truth was like watching the floor vanish beneath their feet. Their aunt, whose kitchen had become a reluctant sanctuary, found herself torn between denial and dread. "You want so badly to believe they're blameless," she told investigators, her hands shaking as she sifted through old photos. "But I see Linda's worry in their eyes every time." Meanwhile, the town itself was forced to reckon with what it meant to have missed the signs, or perhaps to have chosen not to see them. Willow Springs, never large or loud, prided itself on neighborly vigilance and moral clarity. Yet as news quietly leaked of the reopened case, first in cautious whispers at the bakery, then in bolder online forums, the community plunged into an uneasy self-examination. People asked each other hard questions. Had they failed Linda by failing to intervene? Were grief and trauma enough to explain what had transpired? Or did their well-intentioned distance cloak a more sinister negligence? In lockstep with the local reckoning, law enforcement's investigation became a masterclass in modern forensics and psychological profiling. Specialists parsed digital footprints, cross-referenced conflicting testimonies, and mapped timelines with heartbreaking precision. Every new clue bolstered the sense of dread among those few who already suspected. Each fresh fragment, each unearthed lie, pushed the Evans siblings further from sympathy and closer to the realm of the inexplicable and unforgivable. When the truth grew impossible to deny, its impact shattered whatever fragile peace the community had nursed. For the siblings, the revelation meant not just public condemnation, but a fundamental reordering of the only reality they had ever known. Gone was the safety of shared victimhood. In its place arose a confusing landscape of guilt, consequence, and the desperate need for understanding that would never be sated. The reopening of the Evans case, a case no one wanted to believe could possibly get darker, became at last a national byword for the persistence of truth and the devastating unpredictability of family tragedy. Whatever else might now be remembered about Linda Evans, it was clear that time itself was not enough to erase the consequences of pain left unattended, nor the shock that comes when the story you thought you'd finished insists, with chilling clarity, on being told again. Echoes and lessons, a chilling legacy. Long after the shocking headlines faded and the last camera crews packed up their equipment, the ripple effects of the Evans case continued to resonate throughout Willow Springs and beyond. The story of Linda Evans and her children became a chilling point of reference in conversations about family tragedy, adolescent rage, and the invisible fissures running beneath the surface of suburban America. Those who once lived confidently in their own quiet homes now found themselves glancing over their shoulders, haunted by what they had learned could happen not just in distant big cities, but on their very own block. Public response to the court's verdict was equal parts outrage and uneasy reflection. Many in Willow Springs and the wider community were stunned that the sisters were spared the harshest punishment due to their age, despite the gravity of their crime. In online forums and letters to the editor, citizens argued fiercely over the adequacy of the juvenile justice system. Some decried the perceived leniency, worrying aloud that the girls' youth had overshadowed the agony of their calculated actions. Others pointed to the layers of trauma and generational neglect that might have pushed them past the point of no return, insisting that punishment alone would never right what had gone wrong. "There must be a reckoning," one anonymous neighbor wrote to the local paper, "but that reckoning has to reckon with us all." Social workers, teachers, law enforcement officers, and mental health professionals all privately reevaluated their own responsibilities. Support hotlines in the county saw a marked uptick in calls, distressed parents confessing to feelings of burnout, teenagers anonymously sharing fears of domestic unrest, and even educators questioning whether they'd missed red flags among their students. Seminars on child abuse awareness, trauma identification, and family intervention filled to capacity. The tragedy of the Evans household became, for better or worse, a macabre case study in what can slip through the cracks when vigilance and empathy wear thin. Meanwhile, local churches and civic organizations organized town hall meetings, urging residents not to let fear breed isolation. Pastors reminded their congregations that compassion for the suffering must extend beyond the family at the center of the storm. Where was the outreach? Where was the safety net? One youth counselor challenged an audience, her voice trembling with conviction. For many families, the events forced vulnerable conversations about secrets, silence, and the consequences of looking away. The media, never far from a sensational tragedy, mined the case for every angle: human interest documentaries, true crime podcasts, sensationalist headlines about the Sisters of Willow Springs, and in-depth exposés on generational family trauma. Some writers grappled with whether the girls had been monsters or victims, while others used the story to illustrate larger social ailments, the inadequacy of mental health support, the stigma against seeking help, and the pitfalls of a system focused more on punishment than prevention. Movies and books inspired by the case appeared within a few years, each painting the events with varying shades of horror, empathy, and moral ambiguity. In one particularly acclaimed film adaptation, the camera lingered lovingly and uncomfortably on the detritus of everyday life, a school lunchbox, a handwritten shopping list, as if to insist that evil does not just descend from the outside, but often grows, ignored and misunderstood, within the sanctum of home. These works stirred new controversy. Survivors of abuse thanked filmmakers for amplifying warnings, while others criticized the media for turning tragedy into spectacle and disregarding the dignity of the victims. Still, for those closest to Linda Evans, the daily aftermath was measured not in headlines, but in silences. Awkward gatherings where her name was mentioned only in a whisper, birthdays passed without celebration, an empty chair at the Thanksgiving table. Family members who had harbored doubts but never voiced them now grappled with guilt and regret, replaying memories for signs they had missed: a tense phone call, a hurried visit, a cry in the dark that went unheeded. Some found solace in advocacy, volunteering at shelters or speaking out about the need for stronger community networks, while others withdrew further inward, wary that trust could ever be fully rebuilt. For the survivors, Linda's children, her siblings, and the web of relatives orbiting the case, healing was messy and non-linear. Therapy sessions uncovered wounds too deep for a single generation to mend. Sarah, Becky, and Michael's futures would always be marked by what happened, regardless of whether the state deemed them guilty, innocent, or something in between. Their lives, now monitored closely by social workers and scrutinized by old friends, became emblematic of the struggle to move forward after unthinkable acts. Their every stumble was dissected for meaning, every success weighed as redemption or denial. In a way, the Evans legacy lingered as both warning and plea: we can never be too sure of what hurt is hiding next door. Educational programs throughout the region drew direct lessons from the case, launching school-based counseling initiatives and family resource centers that reached far beyond crisis intervention. In classrooms, teachers now received regular training on trauma-informed approaches and were encouraged to create safe spaces for children to express themselves. Police departments increased partnerships with mental health experts, and judges reconsidered the balance between punishment and rehabilitation for juvenile offenders, cementing, in policy if not always in practice, the idea that tragedy does not erupt in a vacuum but is the slow harvest of unattended wounds. Perhaps the deepest echo left by Linda Evans's story was the uncomfortable realization that tragedy never truly leaves a community, it simply changes shape, waiting for attention or neglect to decide its next form. New residents of Willow Springs inherited the story as an urban legend, a whispered warning passed from family to family: pay attention to your loved ones, offer help before it's too late, and believe even the quietest signs that something is wrong. The Evans home, newly painted and inhabited by strangers, stood as the most somber monument of all, a place where, behind closed doors, the unthinkable had become real, and a lesson that still refused to fade with time.